Hi there. I hope that this week is treating you well. Now, before we analyze John Weborg's ideas of baptism and communion, let us take a bird's eye view once again. Our module thesis is as follows. The sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion make manifest the Church's four marks. So in the last video, you parsed portions of Don Frisk's concepts of the Church and sacraments. Frisk recapitulates the four marks of the Christian Church: unity, holiness, catholicity, and apostolicity, and then reviews how the Church is formed and shaped by the Word into a visible historical community, his phrase. Then Frisk enumerates the primary marks of the believer's Church and offers us the covenant's paradigms of baptism and Holy Communion. After that as well, we ought also to briefly review John C. Weborg's perspective on baptism and communion. So you're going to do three shorter things in this video. First, you'll go through some of Weborg's primary context. Second, you'll review his perspective on baptism, tying it explicitly to the Church's ultimate holiness and catholicity. And third, you'll look with greater care at Weborg's arguments about Holy Communion, noting his special emphases on the Church's unity and holiness, and alluding briefly to apostolicity, because that's also vital for our ministries. Let's start that process with a little bit of context. Context for Weborg. John C. Weborg was born in Nebraska in 1937. He is an ordained minister here in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Between 1975 and 2003, Weborg was professor of theology here at the seminary, where he directed the spiritual formation program. He's written a great deal about pietism. Useful fact, Dr. Weborg is himself a survivor of poliomyelitis, commonly called polio, and so he is a person with disabilities. Thus, from what I know, because of the polio, I've never met him, he uses a wheelchair to get around, and the seminary used to have a set of chairlifts for that purpose. And the book of his that we'll be excerpting from is called Made Healthy in Ministry for Ministry from 2011. Second big idea, Weborg's claims about baptism. Weborg makes three claims that are useful for our purposes in terms of baptism. The first one is this: the baptizer, the pastor, is first and foremost a baptized one. The person authorized to baptize others does not do so in his or her own authority, but in God's name. Weborg makes clear both that God is a third-party witness of the rite of baptism, and that baptism is never, ever private. It's communal. Plus, Weborg ties the baptizer's right to baptize to his or her identity as a child of God. He states, God's voice claims them as beloved, as it has done for Jesus, and identifies with them even as it identifies them as the ones called to a special service to word and sacrament. Weborg makes very clear that pastors are not safe from the waters of baptism in this first part of the excerpt, because one's baptism sets one apart for holiness. Additionally, just as Frisk does earlier, Weborg creates a very complete list of all the biblical images to which baptism bears witness. This list includes washing or cleansing, rebirth, deliverance or safety, dying or rising, God's ownership, enlightenment or illumination, clothing and a garment, incorporation into Christ's body, circumcision, seal, baptism in the sea, and identification by name for service. Now, having listed all the images, Weborg describes some of them. And he dwells particularly on the potential of the name for reflection, like God's name. He observes that because we're baptized into the name of Christ, baptism is never, ever private. He states, and I quote, "Baptism is never a private act, just as one's life is never private. Never can a baptized person live into an adapted version of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It does not, and it will not." I love that he uses Vegas as a metaphor there. Plus, in terms of the baptized person putting on the clothing of Christ, Weborg asserts that the clothing never fits us. It's always too big because we never fully live into our baptism. I will allow you to parse what Weborg says about sin, grace, guilt, and release immediately after that on your own. As he continues to parse the multiple images called forth by baptism, Weborg's second big idea about baptism is this. The baptizer, the pastor, is called to minister to a community by divine commandment, and Weborg claims that command is story. So in this section, Weborg describes at length the ECC's prayers in their baptismal liturgies. He asserts that those prayers are actually narrating God's and Jesus' great acts in salvation. Plus, by narrating God's salvific activity over those who are baptized, the pastors and others are participating in that great narrative of God's redemption. He states, where Jesus' command to baptize is carried out, a story is carried on, and the same Spirit present at creation and at Jesus' baptism is now called down on this baptism of this or these people at this place. I agree. Wherever baptism is performed, people entered into God's great story of love and justice and follow in Jesus' footsteps to do his work. Significantly, Weborg also states in line with Galatians 3 that the community saved by God's grace through baptism is actually large enough to incorporate different ethnicities, skin colors, and very likely diverse abilities as well. Third and finally, in terms of baptism, Weborg writes that the baptized community, called into existence by God, enacts its proclamation of the gospel in its life together, aided by each person's unique gifts. He states, each congregant is by virtue of their baptism endowed with gifts and graces to carry out a calling in the world. That basically means that each person has a gift to offer the world because they're all part of Jesus' extended family. We've said that before, and I'm sure that's not news to you folks because you're all seminary students. Let's move on to Weborg's assertions about the bread and wine of communion. First, once again, he claims our position at the table as ministers is delegated. We are not our own. It's also fair to say that people who come to the Lord's table can only pass on what Jesus has given them or us to say or do. So those of us who call Jesus our friend can only do the sorts of things at the table that Jesus has done. And one of the things you will see that Weborg notes that Jesus has done is to welcome and embrace, quote, persons with disabilities, blindness, deafness, and a whole host of psychophysical conditions that churches do not think of as a priority mission, end quote. So if those who minister are really embodying the words of promise of which Weborg writes, should they not also be living out those words in hospitality? Weborg observes that the table fellowship of Holy Communion is also what he calls the extended sociology of baptism. That is, baptism initiates and invites people of diverse abilities into both the unity with Christ and the universality of our fellowship with all who are called and gifted in God's service. And then communion is the way that we are apostled, sent out, in order to proclaim that same oneness and catholicity into a waiting world. Observe this too. At one point on page 80, as I say, Weborg observes Jesus' embodied difference after his resurrection, and then he uses that to make his second claim about communion. People who come to the Lord's table are wounded people, and they, that is we, wound each other. So the best idea is to let Jesus do the work of healing over the passage of time. Weborg asserts, participation at the table is a place where over time the wounded free the wounders, but only after they face the wounds that have been inflicted on fellow communicants or the wounds that persons bring from various times and places. So in our unity in Christ, in our universality, in our holiness, in our engagement with suffering, human beings are wounded, and we bring our wounds with us to the Lord's table. But in our embodiment of the marks of the Church, we can experience the healing grace of Jesus Christ over time, and as we heal, we can in turn heal others. The table is a wonderful place because it helps us to work through our woundedness and to give ourselves and others divine grace. Third, and quite significantly, just as Waldenstrom does in Frisk's analysis, Weborg argues that the meal of bread and wine, quote, is not in memory of a dead Jesus, but an engagement, a communion with the risen Jesus Christ. So Jesus wasn't simply raptured from the tomb on Easter morning, says Weborg. Rather, Jesus was raised and sent back. He moved from the table of the upper room to the places where his disciples were in order to create what Weborg calls a holy human habitat out of his weird, wonderful, and wounded body. At the Lord's table, we are one because Jesus holds us together. We are holy because Jesus sanctifies us. We are Catholic because Jesus calls us in our diverse giftedness. And we are sent out as apostles because Jesus asks all of us to use our gifts in his service. Let's back up and recap. Our module thesis this time around is the sacraments of baptism and communion make manifest the Church's 4 marks. In this video, you attempted to demonstrate that thesis in 3 diffuse ways by engaging with John Weborg's claims in Made Healthy in Ministry for Ministry. You engaged with Weborg's primary context, noting that he too is a person with disabilities. You also interpreted his view of baptism, taking careful note of the connections of that paradigm to the Church's holiness and catholicity, and you analyzed some of Weborg's thoughts about Holy Communion, marking its links to the Church's unity and holiness. That's probably enough of Weborg for now. When you're ready, please go on to revisit Island. Thank you.